The term liberal media or liberal Hollywood or liberal bias has been so thoroughly woven into our political lexicon that it's easy to overlook the fact that there's a part of the entertainment culture that also has a bias, and sometimes it's one that promotes police violence. With me on Truthout Interviews is Aaron Cantu. He's an independent journalist and a contributor to Truthout, whose article, Do What You Gotta Do. Cop shows bolstered the idea that police violence works. It's quite popular on Truthout. Hey Aaron, welcome to Truthout Interviews.
Hey, thanks for having me, Ted.
You know, crime and police dramas have been incredibly popular ever since I can remember, and I guess I'm kind of old, so I can remember a long time. Yeah, in a way, they've been popular because there's a kind of very simple morality to these shows. There's kind of a white hats, black hats duality to them. But in your article, you trace the rise of these cop shows, or at least the popularity of them, to the Watts Riots of 1965.
That research came from reading Radley Balko's book, Rise of the Warrior Cop. And what you had in the 1960s, you had the culture wars, and part of that was the civil rights movement and, sort of the anti-war hippie movement, I guess, kind of came together and presented this threat, or at least the silent majority, as Nixon called them, felt threatened by this rising specter of criminality. And so what happened was certain politicians, most especially Richard Nixon, capitalized on that fear for political gain. So what you had was Nixon running on this sort of law and order, tough on crime approach to this apparent problem. Really also just playing on racial fears, really just playing on fear in general. And so what happened after that whole, that whole era was that crime kind of propelled itself to the forefront of national consciousness as one of the biggest problems in the United States, and that's closely related to drugs as well. And so it was from that point that I guess the militarization of the police became something more prevalent. More punitive policing became something that communities had to deal with. Basically, just kind of spoke to this new idea that crime was a problem and had to be handled as violently and as efficiently and as quickly as possible.
Yeah, Richard Nixon was never one to miss an opportunity to divide and conquer. I mean, that was really, for his political career, that's really what propelled him. He was very adept, and he had people around him that were very good about looking at people's prejudices and exploiting them for political gain.
And I mean, that's something that continues today. Since Nixon, you've had Reagan, who was also a tough on crime zealot. And then you had Bush after 9/11 using fear to justify the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. So, I mean, it's an easy way to get people to kind of follow your agenda. And unfortunately, it's also led to this conflated idea of crime as something that's, widespread, that's something that needs to be controlled, and that benefits those in power who want to grant themselves more unfettered, power to go into these communities and police them.
And then it filters down into the popular culture. So you have television show producers like Dick Wolf, who is at the center of this crime drama that you detail in your article, Chicago PD. Now, I have to, full disclosure here, I've never seen the show, so I don't know much about it other than I know it's a crime drama. I looked at your description. I saw that the way in which the show itself promotes itself on social media and reinforces the show's popularity with its fans. So I have a sense of what it's about. I mean, I can tell it's a crime drama. I'm sure that they try to resolve the white hat, black hat conflict within each episode, or they stretch it out into a longer arc or whatever. But I've seen these type of shows, so it's probably, maybe I'm not missing much, but look at this, the career, say, of Dick Wolf, and he is somebody who has certainly profited off of this political reality that's been framed largely by the right about the law and order on the one hand and the fear of chaos on the other.
Since that time in the 60s and Nixon, and then just the rise of crime as a sort of national obsession, producers in Hollywood, creators of TV shows, they've capitalized on that idea, and the number of cops. I call it the cop booster genre, which is a subgenre of crime dramas in general. You're right. Crime dramas are a very old genre, perhaps one of the most enduring cinematic genres ever. But what has been new since the 1970s obsession with crime was these shows that kind of revered cops in a certain way and presented it in a way that if whatever a cop felt necessary to do in order to tamp down the problem of crime was justified. What sets Chicago PD apart from other shows like The Wire, CSI, is that it's just so brazenly supportive of this idea that the police should be able to do whatever they can, do whatever they want, whether it's torture, whether it's utilizing other violent means to stop crime. The idea being that crime is just such a threat, and it's everywhere, and you're always afraid of it. So by any means necessary, it should be stamped out. So shows like Chicago PD aren't new. What's new about Chicago PD and what stuck out to me was just like its brazen justification of this sort of violent, punitive, even through the use of torture, handling of crime.
Yeah, I mean it's right there in the title of your article. Do what you got to do, right?
Right.
The landmark Supreme Court case in 1966 was called Miranda versus Arizona. Now, that case informed people who were arrested of their rights. So the police had to inform you if you were arrested of your rights. But you also were able to have legal counsel with you if you were interrogated by the police. In your article, you talk not only about the show Chicago PD, but the real Chicago Police Department, in that there have been cases of detainees essentially being tortured.
Yeah, so between 1972 and 1991, you had the systematic torture by the Chicago Police Department of perhaps over 100 young men and boys in police precincts. We don't know exactly how many young men and boys were tortured, but it was slowly revealed by journalists and other investigators that this was a sort of like institutional abuse. It went all the way up the chain of command. Police Commander John Burge also knew about it, also did his part to torture particular suspects. And so, yeah, so you had the Miranda case, and you have at a sort of higher judicial institutional level these protections for alleged suspects. Unfortunately, on the ground, you didn't see those really playing out, and you kind of saw the police just kind of doing whatever they wanted, and just kind of assuming that if they take someone in, they must be a criminal. John Burge, actually, he's an interesting character. He was like, if you watch 24 and you know of Jack Bauer, he was kind of like one of these weird war hero, just crazy violent vigilante. And so not only did he facilitate the torture of over 100 young men and boys, he also engaged in torture himself.
What happened to him?
So he was arrested in 2011, and that was the official charge was that he lied to a court about his knowledge of the torture. It wasn't actually a charge for torture. He's in prison currently. He should be out at the end of next year. So his incarceration, I guess, is one way that I guess these crimes have been that victims have sought justice for those crimes. Another way was there was a multi-million-dollar settlement, two multi-million-dollar settlements issued out last year. In 2003, I believe, the governor of Illinois basically exonerated everybody who was on death row in Illinois for fear that some of their confessions may have been elicited through torture. But the fact is, there's still many, many people in jail, perhaps over 100, who were there because of confessions elicited through torture. So, the case is far from closed as far as the instances of Chicago police torture.
And then you have the current mayor of Chicago, Rahm Emanuel, who, in your article, sort of wanted to close the book or wave away this history within the Chicago Police Department. Now, there's an interesting connection between Rahm Emanuel and the creator of the show, Chicago PD. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So, yeah, Rahm Emanuel, at the end of those multi-million-dollar settlements last year had went on television and said, "Okay, we have to put this behind us. This is a stain on our legacy. We're sorry, but let's move on." What's interesting, though, what I found in my investigation was that Rahm Emanuel's brother, Ari, is head of the talent agency William Morris Endeavor that actually represents Dick Wolf. Dick Wolf's direct agent is Rick Rosen, and Rick and Ari go way back. For Chicago Fire, Rahm Emanuel made an appearance in the pilot episode on the condition that the show would kind of invest in sort of like these goods for the families of firefighters in Chicago. So you have this really, really close connection. Neither City Hall or the show's producers or the talent agency got back to me about actual connections, but I mean they're just so
it's so blatant. I mean,
so blatant. Yeah, it's so plain to see. And so what I had written in my article was that, I mean, the one thing that you can definitely conclude from those sort of those connections is that Chicago PD wouldn't be the kind of show that portrayed the police department in any sort of critical light. And I mean, it's it's quite the opposite of that. I mean, it portrays them in a sort of reverent light, and it shows torture, it shows violence against citizens, and it's portrayed in a way that it's all justified at the end of the day.
The thin blue line, right?
Right.
Between us and chaos. So that's really what it is. There's also, before we conclude, one other question I wanted to ask you, and that's something that you touched on in your article, and that is, when we look at crime dramas, or people are asked about crime in political polling, or if you want to, if somebody's interviewed or whatnot, generally a public opinion about crime, it tends to fall along a dividing line. You have, on the one hand, people that think a criminal engages in crime out of individual behavior. It is their choice that they did this. And so whatever justice is meted out, it's because of choices they made in their life to go down that road. Then there's another view that says, there are, yes, oftentimes it is a choice, but there are also structural forces that tend to channel people into criminal activity because they have no other choices. Now you have shows like Chicago PD that tend to take a very, it seems to be a very black and white view of crime, that the criminals have done this because of individual choice. The police have to be violent because the only way to prevent that kind of chaos of spilling over into society is to just be almost as equally as violent as the criminal. So it's justified. The do what you got to do mentality of shows like Chicago PD. So this just gets reinforced within the show's narrative as well.
It's not necessarily that people from lower income communities are pushed to go into crime. I mean, that is the instance in some cases, but I think the main thing to take away is proximity to crime. And so then you have racial profiling, you have stop and frisk, and all of these. Predictive policing is one of the newest iterations of racial profiling, and all these things are concentrated in low income communities. And so what happens is a whole class of people becomes criminalized. And you're absolutely right that shows like Chicago PD reinforce those ideas. Where are those police located? Where are they putting all their resources? Where are they putting their attention? Well, it's in these communities that have been left behind by the rest of society. I mean, you don't really see, the idea of crime, you don't really think of higher level sort of white collar crime. I mean, you think of it in a certain way that does fall along class and often racial lines. And I mean, this is also, you look at rates of incarceration, you look at rates of marijuana arrest, and I mean, it all kind of is indicative of this fact that like a whole community of people has been criminalized just by being who they are.
Yeah, that crime, if you're poor and you engage in crime, or if you're just poor in general, it's not necessarily because of structural forces beyond your control, say a Great Recession that happened, that forced a whole bunch of people out of work, but rather it's a moral failing, that if you would just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, if you just see the right direction to go in, that things would be better for you. And so it's a very convenient narrative to say, well, all poor people are, there's kind of a moral failing if you become poor.
I think that moral argument, I mean, it's obviously the conservative, oftentimes Republican argument, and it obscures society's. I mean, it obscures the ability of society to see the other forces at work. You know, whether it's a historical legacy of racism, Jim Crow, slavery. You know, whether it's a financial crisis engineered by the 1%. You know, all of these things that kind of create the conditions for crime to happen. Those things people can't readily see. All they see is, you know, people on the street, people doing things that are, you know, oftentimes someone, you know, who's drunk in public. These sort of like nuisances are what get the attention, and unfortunately that detracts from the whole picture, and a lot of people end up having a very skewed vision of criminality.
Well, Aaron, I really want to thank you so much for being on Truthout Interviews.
Thanks a lot, Ted.
You can read Aaron's piece on Truthout. It's called Do What You Gotta Do. Cop shows bolster the idea that police violence works. Thanks for watching Truthout Interviews. I'm Ted Asregadoo. We'll see you next time.